Hiya! Welcome to Sniper's Rest. Sniper's Rest is the last best rest stop in the here and there, the place between where you're coming from and where you're going. I am Sniper Shadow and I reside here in Sniper's Rest as a guide and custodian to those who pass through here. I visit the worlds within the multiverse often, but I am always here to guide and care for the travelers such as yourself that pass through the here and there. Welcome, my friend! Today is an exciting day. We begin a new tale. Today we begin The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. As Dorian sinks into a life of crime and gross sensuality, his body retains perfect youth and vigor, while his recently painted portrait grows day by day into a hideous record of evil, which he must keep hidden from the world. This book was written in 1890 and made its way into the public domain in October of 1994. Please take a rest here before continuing your journey. Grab a drink and a cozy blanket and let us begin this amazing tale of Gothic horror. The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. The Preface. The artist is the creator of beautiful things. To reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. The critic is he who can translate into another manner or a new material his impression of beautiful things. The highest, as the lowest form of criticism, is the mode of autobiography. Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. Those who find beautiful meanings in beautiful things are the cultivated. For these there is hope. They are the elect to whom beautiful things mean only beauty. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. The 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in a glass. The 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his own face in a glass. The moral life of man forms part of the subject matter of the artist, but the morality of art consists in the perfect use of an imperfect medium. No artist desires to prove anything. Even that are true can be proved. No artist has ethical sympathies. An ethical sympathy in an artist is an unpardonable mannerism of style. No artist is ever morbid. The artist can express everything. Thought and language are to the artist instruments of an art. Vice and virtue are to the artist materials for an art. From the point of view of form, the type of all the arts is the art of the musician. From the point of view of feeling, the actor's craft is the type. All art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. Those who read the symbol do so at their peril. It is the spectator, and not life, that art really mirrors. Diversity of opinion about a work of art shows that the work is new, complex, and vital. When critics disagree, the artist is in accord with himself. We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. Art is quite useless. Oscar Wilde. Chapter 1. The studio was filled with the rich odor of roses, and when the light summer wind stirred amidst the trees of the garden, there came through the open window the heavy scent of the lilac, or the more delicate perfume of the pink flowering thorn. From the corner of the divan of Persian saddlebags on which he was lying, smoking, as was his custom, innumerable cigarettes, Lord Henry Wotton could just catch the gleam of the honey-sweet and honey-coloured blossoms of laburnum, whose tremendous branches seemed hardly able to bear the burden of a beauty so flame-like as theirs, and now and then the fantastic shadows of birds in flight flitted across the long tussore silk curtains that was stretched in front of the huge window, producing a kind of momentary Japanese effect, and making him think of all those pallid, jade-faced painters of Tokyo who, through the medium of an art that is necessarily immobile, seek to convey this sense of swiftness in motion. The sullen manner of bees shouldering their way through the long unmown grass, or circling with monotonous insistence around the dusty gilt horns of the straggling woodbine, seemed to make the stillness more oppressive. The dim roar of London was like a bourbon note of a distant organ. In the centre of the room, clamped to an upright easel, stood the full-length portrait of a young man of extraordinary personal beauty, and in front of it, some little distance away, was sitting the artist himself, Basil Hallward, whose sudden disappearance some years ago caused at the time such public excitement and gave rise to so many strange conjectures. As the painter looked at the gracious and comely form he had so skilfully mirrored in his art, a smile of pleasure passed across his face, and seemed about to linger there, but he suddenly started up, and closing his eyes, placed a finger upon the lids, as though he sought to imprison within his brain some curious dream for which he feared he might awake.
"It is your best work, Basil, the best thing you have ever done," said Lord Henry languidly. "You must send it next year to Govensver. The Academy is too large and too vulgar. Whenever I have gone there, there have either been so many people that I have not been able to see the pictures, which was dreadful, or so many pictures that I have not been able to see the people, which was worse. The Govensver is really the only place."
"I don't think I shall send it anywhere," he said, tossing with his head back in that odd way that used to make his friends laugh at him at Oxford. "No, I won't send it anywhere." Lord Henry elevated his eyebrows and looked at him in amazement through thin blue wreaths of smoke that curled up in such fanciful whirls from his heavy opium-tainted cigarette.
"Not send it anywhere? My dear fellow, why? Have you any reason? What odd chaps you painters are! You do anything in the world to gain a reputation, and as soon as you have one, you seem to want to throw it away. How silly of you! For there is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about. A portrait like this would set you far above all the young men in England, and make the old men quite jealous, if old men were ever capable of such any emotion."
"I know he will laugh at me," he replied, "but I can't really exhibit it. I have put too much of myself into it." Lord Henry stretched himself out on the divan and laughed. "Yes, I knew you would, but it is quite true all the same."
"Too much of yourself in it, upon my word, Basil. I didn't know you were so vain. And really I can't see any resemblance between you, and with your rugged strong face and your coal-black hair, and this young Adonis, who looks as if he was made out of ivory and rose-leaves. Why, my dear Basil, he is a Narcissus. And you, well, of course you have an intellectual expression and all that, but beauty, real beauty, ends where an intellectual expression begins. Intellect in itself is a mode of exaggeration, and destroys the harmony of any face. The moment one sits down to think, one becomes all nose, or all forehead, or something horrid. Look at the successful men in any of the learned professions. How perfectly hideous they are! Except, of course, in the church. But then in the church they don't think. A bishop keeps on saying at the age of 80 what he was told to say as a boy of 18. And as a natural consequence he is always looking absolutely delightful. Your mysterious young friend, whose name you have never told me, but whose pictures really fascinate me, never thinks. I feel quite sure of that. He is some brainless, beautiful creature who should always be here in winter when we have no flowers to look at, and always here in summer when we want something to chill our intelligence. Don't flatter yourself, Basil. You are not in the least like him. You don't understand me, Harry, said the artist. Of course I am not like him. I know that perfectly well. Indeed, I should be sorry to look like him. You shrug your shoulders. I am telling the truth. There is a fatality in all physics and intellectual distinction. The sort of fatality that seems to a dog through history the faltering steps of kings. It is better not to be different from one's fellows. The ugly and the stupid have the best of it in this world. They can sit at their ease and gape at the play. If they know nothing of victory, they are at least spared the knowledge of defeat. They live as though we should all live, undisturbed, indifferent, and without disquiet. They neither bring ruin upon others, nor receive it from alien hands. Your rank and your wealth, Harry, my brains such as they are, my art, whatever it may be worth, Dorian Gray's good looks, we shall all suffer for what the gods have given us. Suffer terribly. Dorian Gray, is that his name? Asked Lord Henry, walking across the studio towards Basil Hallward. Yes, that is his name. I didn't intend to tell it to you. But why not? Oh, I can't explain. When I like people immensely, I never tell their names to anyone. It is like surrendering a part of them. I have grown to love secrecy. It seems to be the only one thing that can make modern life mysterious or marvellous to us. The commonest thing is delightful, if one only hides it. When I leave town now, I never tell people where I am going. If I did, I would lose all my pleasure. It is a silly habit, I dare say, but somehow it seems to bring a great deal of romance into one's life. I suppose you think me awfully foolish about it. Not at all, answered Lord Henry. Not at all, my dear Basil. You seem to forget that I am married, and one charm of marriage is that makes a life of deception absolutely necessary for both parties. I never know where my wife is, and my wife never knows what I am doing. Or when we meet, we do meet occasionally, when we dine out together, or go down to the Duke's. We tell each other the most absurd stories with the most serious faces. My wife is very good at it. Much better, in fact, than I am. She never gets confused over our dates, and I always do. But when she does find me out, she makes no row at all. Sometimes I wish she would, but she merely laughs at me. I hate the way you talk about your married life, Harry, said Basil, strolling towards the door that led into the garden. I believe that you are really a very good husband, but that you are thoroughly ashamed of your own virtues. You are an extraordinary fellow. You never say a moral thing, and yet you never do anything wrong. Your cynicism is simply a pose. Being natural is simply a pose, and the most irritating pose I know, cried Lord Henry, laughing, and the two young men went out into the garden together, and ensconced themselves on a long bamboo seat that stood in the shade of the tall laurel bush. The sunlight slipped over the polished leaves, and in the grass white daisies were tremulous. After a pause, Lord Henry pulled out his watch. "I am afraid I must be going, Basil," he murmured. "Before I go, I insist on your answering a question I put to you some time ago." "What is that?"
said the painter, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground.
"You know quite well."
"I do not, Harry."
"Well, I will tell you what it is. I want you to explain to me why you won't exhibit Dorian Gray's picture. I want the real reason."
"I have told you the real reason."
"No, you did not. You said it was because there was too much of yourself in it. Now that is childish."
"Harry," said Basil Hallward, looking him straight in the face, "every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not of the sitter. The sitter is merely an accident, on occasion. It is not he who is revealed by the painter, but rather the painter, who on the coloured canvas reveals himself. The reason I will not exhibit this picture is that I am afraid I have shown in the secret of my own soul." Lord Henry laughed.
"And what is that?" he asked.
"I will tell you," said Hallward. But an expression of perplexity came over his face.
"I am all expectations, Basil," continued his companion, glancing at him.
"Oh, there is really very little to tell, Harry," said the painter, "and I am afraid you will hardly understand it. Perhaps you will hardly believe it." Lord Henry smiled, and leaned down and plucked a pink-petalled daisy from the ground and examined it.
"I am quite sure I shall understand it," he replied,
gazing intently at the little golden and white feathered disc.
"As for believing things, I can believe anything, provided that it is quite incredible."
The wind shook some blossoms from the trees, and the heavy lilac blooms and their clustering stars moved to and fro in the languid air. A grasshopper began to chirrup by the wall, and like a big blue thread a long thin dragonfly floated past on brown gauze wings. Lord Henry felt himself as if he could hear Basil's heart beating, and wondered what was coming. "The story is simply this," said the painter, after some time. 2 months ago I went to a crush at Lady Brandon's. You know we poor artists have to show ourselves in society from time to time, just to remind the public that we are not savages. With an evening coat and a white tie, as you told me once, anybody, even a stockbroker, can gain a reputation for being civilized. Well, after I had been in the room for about 10 minutes, talking to a huge, overdressed dowagers and tenacious academians, I suddenly became conscious of someone looking at me. I turned halfway round and saw Dorian Gray for the first time. When our eyes met, I felt that I was growing pale. A curious sensation of terror came over me. I knew I had come face to face with someone whose mere personality was so fascinating, if I allowed it to do so, it would absorb my whole nature, my whole soul, my very art itself. I did not want any external influence in my life. You know yourself, Harry, how independent I am by nature. I have always been my own master, had at least been so until I met Dorian Gray. Then, I don't know how to explain it to you. Something seemed to tell me that I was on the verge of a terrible crisis in my life. I had a strange feeling that fate had in store for me exquisite joys and exquisite sorrows. I grew afraid and turned to quit the room. It was not conscience that made me do it, and a sort of cowardice. I take no credit for myself trying to escape. Conscience and cowardice are really the same thing, Basil. Conscience is the trade name of the firm. That is all. I don't believe that, Harry. And I don't believe you do either. However, whatever was my motive, and I may have been pride, for I used to be very proud, I certainly struggled to the door.
There, of course, I stumbled against Lady Brandon. "You are not going to run away so soon, Mr. Hallward!" she screamed out. You know her curiously shrill voice. "Yes, she is a peacock in everything but beauty," said Lord Henry, pulling the daisy to bits with his long, nervous fingers. "I could not get rid of her. She brought me up to royalties, and people with stars and garters, and elderly ladies with gigantic tiaras and parrot noses. She spoke of me as her dearest friend. I'd only met her once before, but she took it into her head to lionize me. I believe some picture of mine had made great success at the time, at least had been, chatted about in the penny news, which in the 19th century standard of immortality. Suddenly I found myself face to face with a young man whose personality had so strangely stirred me. We were quite close, almost touching. Our eyes meet again. It was reckless of me, but I asked Lady Brandon to introduce me to him. Perhaps it was not so reckless after all. It was simply inevitable. We would have spoken to each other without any introduction. I am sure of that. Dorian told me so afterwards. He too felt that we were destined to know each other. "How did Lady Brandon describe this wonderful young man?" asked his companion. "I know she goes in for giving a rapid précis of all her guests. I remember her bringing me up to a truculent and red-faced old gentleman covered all over in orders and ribbons, and hissing into my ear in a tragic whisper, which must have been perfected to be audible to everyone in the room, the most astounding details. I simply fled. I like to find people out for myself, but Lady Brandon treats her guests as an auctioneer treats his good. She either explains them entirely away, or tells one everything about them except what one wants to know." "Oh, poor Lady Brandon, you are hard on her, Harry," said Hallward listlessly. "My dear fellow, she tried to found a salon, and only succeeded in opening a restaurant. How could I admire her? But tell me, what did she say about Mr. Dorian Gray?" "Oh, something like, 'Charming boy, a poor dear mother, and absolutely inseparable. I quite forgot what he does. Afraid he doesn't do anything. Oh yes, he plays the piano. Or is that the violin, dear Mr. Gray?'" Neither of us could help laughing, and we became friends at once. "Laughter is not at all a bad beginning for a friendship, and it is far the best ending for one," said the young lord, plucking another daisy. Hallward shook his head. "You don't understand what friendship is, Harry," he murmured. "Or what amity is, for that matter. You like everyone. That is to say, you are indifferent to everyone." "How horribly unjust of you!" cried Lord Henry, tilting his hat back and looking up at the little clouds that, like ravelled skins of glossy white silk, were drifting across the hollowed turquoise summer sky. "Yes, horribly unjust of you. I make a great difference between people. I choose my friends for their good looks, my acquaintances for their good character, and my enemies for their good intellect. A man can't be too careful of the choice of his enemies. I have not got one who is a fool. They are all men of some intellectual power, and consequently they all appreciate me. Is that very vain of me? I think it is rather vain." "I should think, Harry. But according to your category, I must merely be an acquaintance." "My dear old Basil, you are much more than an acquaintance." "And much less than a friend. A sort of brother, I suppose?" "Oh, brothers! I don't care for brothers. My elder brother won't die, and my younger brother never seems to do anything." "Harry!"
exclaimed Hallward, frowning.
My dear fellow, I'm not quite serious, but I can't help detesting my relations. I suppose it comes from the fact that none of us can stand other people having the same faults as ourselves. I quite sympathize with the rage of the English democracy against what they call the vices of the upper orders. The masses feel that drunkenness, stupidity, and immorality should be their own special property, and that if any one of us makes an ass of himself, he is poaching on their preserves. When poor Southwark got into the divorce court, their indignation was quite magnificent. And yet I don't suppose that 10% of the proletariat live correctly.
I don't agree with a single word you have said, and what is more, Harry, I'm sure you don't either. Lord Henry stroked his pointed brown beard and tapped the toe of his patent leather boots with the tasselled ebony cane.
How English you are, Basil. That is the second time you have made that observation. If one puts forward the idea to a true Englishman, always a rash thing to do. He never dreams of considering whether the idea is right or wrong. The only thing he considers of any importance is whether one believes it oneself. Now, the value of the idea has nothing whatsoever to do with the sincerity of the man who expresses it. Indeed, the probabilities are that the more insincere the man is, the more purely intellectual the idea will be, as in that case it will not be coloured by either his wants, his desires, or his prejudices. However, I don't propose to discuss politics, sociology, or metaphysics with you. I like persons better than principles, and I like persons with no principles better than anything else in the world. Now tell me more about Mr. Dorian Gray. How often do you see him?
Every day. I couldn't be happy if I didn't see him every day. He is absolutely necessary to me.
How extraordinary! I thought you would never care for anything but your art.
He is all my art is to me now, the painter said gravely. Sometimes I think, Harry, that there are only two eras of importance in the world history. The first is the appearance of the new medium for art, and the second is the appearance of a new personality for art also. When the invention of oil paintings was to the Venetians, the face of the Antonius was to the late Greek sculpture, and the face of Dorian Gray will some day be to me. It is not merely that I paint from him, draw from him, sketch from him. Of course, I have done all that. But he is much more than a model or a sitter. I won't tell you that I am dissatisfied with what I have done of him, or that his beauty is such that art cannot express it. There is nothing that art cannot express, and I know that the work I have done since I met Dorian Gray is good work. It is the best work of my life. But in some curious way, I wonder, will you understand me? His personality has suggested to me an entirely new manner in art, an entirely new mode of style. I see things differently. I think of them differently. I can now recreate life in a way that was hidden from me before. A dream of form in the days of thought. Who is it who says that? I forget. But it is what Dorian Gray has been to me. The merely visible presence of this lad, for he seems to me little more than a lad, though he is really over 20, is merely visible presence. Ah, I wonder, can you realize all that that means? Unconsciously, he defines me the lines of a fresh school. A school that have in it all the passion of the romantic spirit, all the perfection of the spirit that is Greek, the harmony of the soul and body. How much that is! We in our madness have separated the two, and have invented the realism that is vulgar, an ideality that is void. Harry, if only you knew what Dorian Gray is to me! You remember that landscape of mine, for which anew
offered me such a huge price, but which I would not part with. It is one of the best things I have ever done. And why is it so? Because while I was painting it, Dorian Gray sat beside me. Some subtle influence passed from him to me, and for the first time in my life I saw the plain woodland, the wonder I had always looked for and always missed. Basil, this is extraordinary. I must see Dorian Gray.
Hallward got up from the seat and walked up and down the garden. After some time he came back. Harry, he said, Dorian Gray is simply to me a motive in art. You might see nothing in him. I see everything in him. He is never more present in my work than when no images of him are there. He is a suggestion, as I have said, of a new manner. I find him in the curves of certain lines, and in the loveliness and subtleties of certain colours. That is all.
Then why won't you exhibit his portrait?
Asked Lord Henry. Because without intending it, I have put into some expression of all this curiosity, artistic idolatry, of which, of course, I have never cared to speak to him. He knows nothing about it. He shall never know anything about it. But the world might guess it, and I will not bare my soul to their shallow, prying eyes. My heart shall never be put under their microscope. There is too much of myself in the thing. Harry, too much of myself.
Poets are not so scrupulous as you are. They know how useful passion is for publication. Nowadays a broken heart will run to many editions.
I hate them for it, cried Hallward. An artist should create beautiful things, but should put nothing of his own life into them. We live in an age where men treat art as if it were meant to be a form of autobiography. We have lost the abstract sense of beauty. Some day I will show the world, and for what reason, the world shall never see my portrait of Dorian Gray.
I think you are wrong, Basil. But I won't argue with you. It is only the intellectually lost who ever argue. Tell me, is Dorian Gray very fond of you?
The painter considers for a few moments. He likes me, he answered after a pause. I know he likes me. Of course I flatter him dreadfully. I find strange pleasure in saying things to him that I know I shall be sorry for having said. As a rule, he is charming to me. And we sit in a studio and talk of 1,000 things. Now and then, however, he is horribly thoughtless, and seems to take a real delight in giving me pain. Then I feel, Harry, that I had given away my whole soul to someone who treats it as if it were a flower to put in his coat, a bit of decoration to charm his vanity, an ornament for a summer's day.
Days in summer, Basil, are apt to linger, murmured Lord Henry. Perhaps you will tire sooner than he will. It is sad to think of, but there is no doubt that genius lasts longer than beauty. That accounts for the fact that we shall take such pains to over-educate ourselves. In the wild struggle for existence, we want to have something that endures. And so we will fill our minds with rubbish and facts, in the silly hope of keeping our place. The thoroughly well-informed man, that is the modern ideal. And the mind of the thoroughly well-informed man is a dreadful thing. It is like a bric-a-brac shop, all monsters and dust, with everything priced above its proper value. I think you will tire first all the same. Some day you will look at your friend, and he will seem to you to be a little out of drawing, or you won't like his tone of colour or something. You will bitterly reproach him in your own heart, and seriously think that he has behaved very badly to you. The next time he calls you will be perfectly cold and indifferent. It will be a great pity, for it will alter you. What you have told me is quite a romance of art, one might call it. And the worst of having a romance of any kind is that it leaves one so unromantic.
Harry, don't talk like that. As long as I live, the personality of Dorian Gray will dominate me. You can't feel what I feel. You change too often.
Ah, my dear Basil, that is exactly why I can feel it. Those who are faithful know only the trivial side of love. It is the faithlessness who knows love's tragedies.
And Lord Henry struck a light on a dainty silver case and began to smoke a cigarette with a self-conscious and satisfied air, as if he had summed up the whole world in a phrase. There was a rustle of chirruping sparrows in the green lacquer of the leaves of ivy, and the blue cloud shadows cast themselves across the grass like swallows. How pleasant it was in the garden, and how delightful other people's emotions were. Much more delightful than their ideas, it seemed to him. One's own soul and the passions of one's friends, those were the fascinating things in life. He pictured to himself with silent amusement the tedious luncheon that he had missed by staying so long with Basil Hallward. Had he gone to his aunt's, he would have been sure to have met Lord Goodbody there, and the whole conversation would have been about feeding of the poor and the necessity for model lodging houses. Each class would have preached the importance of those virtues for whose exercise there was no necessity in the lives of our own. The rich would have spoken on the value of thrift, and the idle eloquent over the dignity of labour. It was charming to have escaped all that. And he thought of his aunt. An idea seemed to strike him. He turned to Hallward and said, "My dear fellow, I have just remembered." "Remembered what, Harry?"
"Where I have heard the name of Dorian Gray."
"Where was it?" asked Hallward with a slight frown.
"Don't look so angry, Basil. It was my aunt, Lady Agatha's. She told me she had discovered a wonderful young man who was going to help her in the East End, and that his name was Dorian Gray. I am bound to state that she never told me he was good-looking. Women have no appreciation of good looks. At least good women have not. She said that he was very earnest and had a beautiful nature. I at once pictured myself to a creature with spectacles and lank hair, horribly freckled, and trampling about on huge feet. I wish I had known it was your friend."
"I am very glad you didn't, Harry."
"Why?"
"I don't want you to meet him."
"Why don't you want me to meet him?"
"No, I don't."
"Mr. Dorian Gray is in the studio, sir," said the butler, coming into the garden. "You must introduce me now," cried Lord Henry, laughing.
The painter turned to his servant, who stood blinking in the sunlight. "Ask Mr. Gray to wait, Parker. I shall be in a few moments." The man bowed and went up the walk. Then he looked at Lord Henry. "Dorian Gray is my dearest friend," he said. "He has a simple and beautiful nature. Your aunt was quite right in what she said of him. Don't spoil him. Don't try to influence him. Your influence would be bad. The world is wide and has many marvellous people in it. Don't take away from me the one person who gives to my art whatever charm it possesses. My life as an artist depends on him. Mind, Harry, I trust you." He spoke very slowly, and the words seemed wrung out of him almost against his will.
"What nonsense you talk!"
said Lord Henry, smiling, and taking Hallward by the arm, he almost led him into the house. Chapter 2. As they entered, they saw Dorian Gray. He was seated at the piano, with his back to them, turning over the pages of a volume of Schumann's forest scenes.
"You must lend me these, Basil," he cried. "I want to learn them. They are perfectly charming."
"That depends entirely on how you sit today, Dorian."
"Oh, I am tired of sitting. And I don't want a life-size portrait of myself,"
answered the lad, swinging round on the music stool in a wilful, petulant manner. When he caught sight of Lord Henry, a faint blush coloured his cheeks for a moment, and he started up.
"I beg your pardon, Basil. I did not know you had anyone with you."
"This is Lord Henry Wotton, Dorian, an old Oxford friend of mine. I have just been telling him what a capital sitter you were, and now you have spoiled everything."
"You have not spoiled my pleasure in meeting you, Mr. Gray,"
said Lord Henry, stepping forward and extending his hand.
"My aunt has often spoken to me about you. You are one of her favourites, and I am afraid also one of her victims."
"I am in Lady Agatha's black books at present," Dorian answered with a funny look of petulance. "I promised to go to a club in Whitechapel with her last Tuesday, and I really forgot all about it. We were to have played a duet together. 3 duets, I believe. I don't know what she will say to me. I am far too frightened to call."
"Oh, I will make your peace with my aunt. She is quite devoted to you. And I don't think it really matters about you not being there. The audience probably thought it was a duet. When Aunt Agatha sits down to the piano, she makes quite enough noise for 2 people."
"That is very horrid to her, and not very nice to me," answered Dorian, laughing. Lord Henry looked at him. Yes, he was certainly wonderfully handsome, with his finely curved scarlet lips, his frank blue eyes, his crisp golden hair. There was something in his face that made one trust him at once. All the candour of youth was there, as well as all the youth's passionate purity. One felt that he had kept himself unspotted from the world. No wonder Basil Hallward worshipped him.
"You are too charming to go in for philanthropy, Mr. Gray. Far too charming."
And Lord Henry flung himself down on the divan and opened his cigarette case. The painter had been busy mixing his colours and getting his brushes ready. He was looking worried when he heard Lord Henry's last remark. He glanced at him, hesitated for a moment, and then said, "Harry, I want to finish this picture today. Would you think it awfully rude of me if I asked you to go away?" Lord Henry smiled and looked at Dorian Gray.
"Am I to go, Mr. Gray?" he asked.
"Oh, please don't, Lord Henry. I see that Basil is in one of his sulky moods today. I can't bear him when he sulks. Besides, I want you to tell me why I should not go in for philanthropy."
"I don't know that I shall tell you that, Mr. Gray. It is so tedious a subject that one would have to talk seriously about it. But I certainly shall not run away, now that you have asked me to stop. You really don't mind, Basil, do you? You have often told me that you liked your sitters to have someone to chat to."
Hallward bit his lip. "If Dorian wishes it, of course you must stay. Dorian's whims are laws to everybody except himself." Lord Henry took up his hat and gloves.
"You are very pressing, Basil, but I am afraid I must go. I have promised to meet a man at the Orleans. Goodbye, Mr. Gray. Come and see me sometime in the afternoon on Curzon Street. I am nearly always home at 5 o'clock. Write to me when you are coming. I should be sorry to miss you."
"Basil," cried Dorian Gray, "if Lord Henry Wotton goes, then I shall go too. You never open your lips while you are painting, and it is horribly dull, standing on a platform and trying to look pleasant. Ask him to stay. I insist upon it." Stay, Harry, to oblige Dorian, and to oblige me, said Hallward, gazing intently at his picture. It is quite true. I never talk when I am working, and I never listen either. It must be dreadfully tedious for my unfortunate sitters. I do beg you to stay.
But what about my man at the Orleans?
The painter laughed. I don't think there will be any difficulty about that. Sit down again, Harry. And now, Dorian, get up on the platform, and don't move about too much, or pay any attention to what Lord Henry says. He has a very bad influence over all his friends, with a single exception of myself. Dorian stepped up onto the dais with the air of a young Greek martyr, and made a little mew of discontent to Lord Henry, whom he had rather taken a fancy. He was so unlike Basil. They made a delightful contrast, and he had such a beautiful voice. After moments he said to him,
Have you really a very bad influence, Lord Henry? As bad as Basil says? There is no such thing as a good influence, Mr. Gray. All influence is immoral. Immoral from the scientific point of view.
Why?
Because to influence a person is to give him one's own soul. He does not think his natural thoughts, or burn with his natural passions. His virtues are not real to him. His sins, if there are such things as sins, are borrowed. He becomes an echo of someone else's music, an actor of a part that he has not been written. The aim of life is self-development, to realize one's nature perfectly. That is what each of us are here for. People are afraid of themselves nowadays. They have forgotten the highest of all duties, the duty that one owes to one's self. Of course they are charitable. They feed the hungry, they clothe the beggar. But their souls starve and are naked. Courage has gone out of our race. Perhaps we never really had it. The terror of society, which is a basis of morals, the terror of God, which is the secret of religion, these two things are the things that govern us, and yet...
Just turn your head a little bit more to the right, Dorian, like a good boy, said the painter, deep in his work, and conscious only that a look had come onto the lad's face that he had never seen there before. And yet, continued Lord Henry, in his low, musical voice, and with that graceful wave of the hand that was always so characteristic of him, and that he had even in his Eton days.
I believe that if one man were to live out his life fully and completely, were to give form to every feeling, expression to every thought, reality to every dream, I believe that the world would gain such a fresh impulse of joy that we would forget all the Maliades and the medievalisms and return to the Helleniac ideal, to something finer and richer than the Helleniac ideal. But the bravest man amongst us is afraid of himself. The mutilation of the savage has a tragic survival in the self-denial that mars our lives. We are punished for our refusals. Every impulse that we strive to strangle broods in the mind and poisons us. The body sins once, and has done with its sin, for action is a mode of purification. Nothing remains but the recollection of pleasure, or the luxury of a regret. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Resist it, and your soul grows sick with the longing for things that it has forbidden itself, with the desire for what its monstrous laws have made monstrous and unlawful. It has been said that the great events of the world take place in the brain. It is in the brain, and the brain only, that the greatest sins of the world take place also. You, Mr. Gray, you yourself, with your rose-red youth and your rose-white boyhood, you have had passions that have made you afraid, thoughts that have filled you with terror, daydreams and sleeping dreams whose mere memory might stain your cheek with shame. Stop, faltered Dorian Gray. "Stop, you bewilder me. I don't know what to say. There is some answer to you, but I cannot find it. Don't speak, let me think. Or rather, let me try not to think."
For nearly 10 minutes he stood motionless with parted lips and eyes strangely bright. He was dimly conscious that the entirely fresh influences were at work within him. Yet they seemed to him to have come from himself. The few words that Basil's friends had said to him, words spoken by chance no doubt, and with wilful paradox in them, seemed to have touched some secret chord that had never been touched before, but that he had felt, now vibrating and throbbing in curious pulses. Music had stirred in him like that. Music had troubled him many times, but music was not articulate. It was not a new world, but rather another chaos that it created in us. Words, mere words. How terrible they were, how clear and vivid and cruel. One could not escape from them, and yet what a subtle magic there was in them. They seemed to be able to give a plastic form to formless things, and to have a music of their own as sweet as that of the viol or the lute. Mere words. Was there anything so real as words? Yes, there had been things in his boyhood that he had not understood. He understood them now. Life suddenly became fiery-colored to him. It seemed to him that he had been walking in fire. Why had he not known it? With his subtle smile, Lord Henry watched him. He knew the precise psychological moment when to say nothing. He felt intensely interested. He was amazed at the sudden impression that his words had produced, and remembering a book that he had read when he was 16, a book which had revealed to him much of what he had not known before, he wondered whether Dorian Gray was passing through a similar experience. He had merely shot an arrow into the air. Had it hit the mark? How fascinating the lad was. Hallward painted away with that marvellous bold touch of his, that had the true refinement and perfect delicacy that in art, at any rate, comes from only strength. He was unconscious of the silence. "Basil, I am tired of standing," cried Dorian Gray suddenly. "I must go out and sit in the garden. The air is stifling in here." "My dear fellow, I am so sorry. When I am painting I can't think of anything else. But you never sat better. You were perfectly still, and I have caught the effect I wanted. The half-parted lips and the bright look in the eyes. I don't know what Henry has been saying to you, but he has certainly made you the world's most wonderful expression. I suppose he has been paying you compliments. You mustn't believe a word he says." "He has certainly not been paying me compliments. Perhaps that is the only reason I don't believe anything he has told me."
"You know you believe it all," said Lord Henry, looking at him with his dreamy, languorous eyes. "I will go out into the garden with you. It is horribly hot in the studio. Basil, let us have something iced to drink. Something with strawberries in it."
"Certainly, Harry. Just touch the bell, and when Parker comes I will tell him what you want. I have got to work up this background, so I will join you later on. Don't keep Dorian too long. I have never been in better form painting than I am today. This is going to be my masterpiece. It is my masterpiece as it stands." Lord Henry went out into the garden and found Dorian Gray burying his face in the great cool lilac blossoms, feverishly drinking in their perfume as if it had been wine. He came close to him and put a hand upon his shoulder.
"You are quite right to do that," he said. "Nothing can cure the soul but the senses, just as nothing can cure the senses but the soul."
The lad started and drew back. He was bareheaded, and the leaves had tossed his rebellious curls and tangled all their gilded threads. There was a look of fear in his eyes, such people when they have suddenly been awakened. His finely chiseled nostrils quivered, and some nerve shook in the scarlet of his lips and left them trembling.
Yes, continued Lord Henry, it is one of the greatest secrets in life, to cure the soul by means of the senses, and the senses by means of the soul. You are a wonderful creation. You know more than you think you know, just as you know less than you want to know.
Dorian Gray frowned and turned his head away. He could not help liking the tall, graceful young man who was standing by him. His romantic olive-coloured face and worn expression interested him. There was something in his low, languid voice that was absolutely fascinating. His cool, white, flower-like hands even had a curious charm. They moved as he spoke, like music, and seemed to have a language of their own. But he felt afraid of him, and ashamed of being afraid. Why had it been left for a stranger to reveal him to himself? He had known Basil Hallward for months, but the friendship between them had never altered him. Suddenly there had come some one across his life who seemed to have disclosed him life's mystery. And yet, what was there to be afraid of? He was not a schoolboy, or a girl. It was absurd to be frightened.
"Let us go and sit in the shade," said Lord Henry. "Parker has brought out the drinks, and if you stay any longer under this glare you will be quite spoiled, and Basil will never paint you again. You really must not allow yourself to become sunburnt. It would be unbecoming."
"What can it matter?" cried Dorian Gray, laughing as he sat down on the seat at the end of the garden.
"It should matter everything to you, Mr. Gray."
"Why?"
"Because you have the most marvellous youth, and youth is the one thing worth having."
"I don't feel that, Lord Henry."
"No, you don't feel it now. Some day, when you are old and wrinkled and ugly, when thought has seared your forehead with its lines, and passion branded your lips with its hideous fires, you will feel it. You would feel it terribly. Now, wherever you go, you charm the world. Will it always be so? You have a wonderfully beautiful face, Mr. Gray. Don't frown. You have. And beauty is a form of genius. It's higher, indeed, than genius, as it needs no explanation. It is of the great facts of the world, like sunlight, or springtime, or the reflection of dark waters in that silver shell we call the moon. It cannot be questioned. It has its divine right of sovereignty. It makes princes of those who have it. You smile? Ah! When you have lost it, you won't smile. People say that beauty is only superficial. That may be so, but at least it is not so superficial as thought is. To me, beauty is the wonder of wonders. It is only shallow people who do not judge by appearances. The true mystery of the world is not visible, not the invisible. Yes, Mr. Gray, the gods have been good to you, but what the gods give you, they quickly take away. You have only a few years in which to live really, perfectly, and fully. When your youth goes, your beauty will go with it, and then you will suddenly discover that there are no triumphs left for you, or that you have to content yourself with those who mean triumph that the memory of your past will make more bitter than defeats. Every mouth as it wanes brings you nearer to something dreadful. Time is jealous of you and wars against your lilies and your roses. You will become sallow, hollow-cheeked and dull-eyed. You will suffer horribly. Ah! Realize your youth while you have it. Don't squander the gold of your days, listening to the tedious. trying to improve the hopeless failure, or giving away your life to the ignorant, the common, and the vulgar. These are the sickly aims, the false ideals of our age. Live. Live the wonderful life. Live the life that is in you. Let nothing be lost upon you. Be always searching for new sensations. Be afraid of nothing. A new hedonism. That is what our century wants. You might be its visible symbol. With your personality, there is nothing you couldn't do. The world belongs to you for a season. The moment I met you, I saw that you were quite unconscious of what you really are, of what you really might be. There was so much in you charmed me that I felt I must tell you something about yourself. I thought how tragic it would be if you were wasted. Therefore, is such a little time that your youth will last. Such little time. The common hill flowers wither, but they blossom again. The ladden burr will be back as yellow as next June as it is now. In a month there will be purple stars on the clematis, and a year after that the green night of its leaves will hold the purple stars. But we never get back our youth. The pulse of joy that beats in us at 20 becomes sluggish. Our limbs fail. Our senses rot. We degenerate into hideous puppets haunted by the memory of the passions of which we were too much afraid, and the exquisite temptations of that of the courage does not yield to. Youth. Youth. There is absolutely nothing in the world but youth.
Dorian Gray listened, open-eyed and wondering. The spray of the lilac fell from his hand upon the gravel. A furry bee came and buzzed around it for a moment. Then it began to scramble all over the oval stellated globe of the tiny blossoms. He watched it with a strange interest in trivial things that we try to develop when things are of high importance, making us afraid, or when we are stirred by some new emotion for which we cannot find expression, or when some thought that terrifies us lays sudden siege to the brain and calls on us to yield. After a time the bee flew away. He saw it creeping into a stained trumpet of a Tyrian convulsus. The flower seemed to quiver, and then swayed gently to and fro. Suddenly the painter appeared at the door of the studio and made a staccato sign for them to come in. They turned to each other and smiled. "I am waiting," he cried. "Do come in, the light is quite perfect. You can bring your drinks." They rose up and sauntered down the walk together. 2 green and white butterflies fluttered past them, and the pear tree in the corner of the garden. A thrush began to sing.
"You are glad to have met me, Mr. Gray," said Lord Henry, looking at him.
"Yes, I am glad now. I wonder, shall I always be glad?"
"Always. That is a dreadful word. It makes me shudder when I hear it. Women are so fond of using it. They spoil every romance by trying to make it last forever. It is a meaningless word, too. The only difference between caprice and a lifelong passion is that the caprice lasts a little longer."
As they entered the studio, Dorian Gray put his hand upon Lord Henry's arm. "In that case, let our friendship be a caprice," he murmured, flushing at his own boldness, then stepped up on the platform and resumed his pose. Lord Henry flung himself into a large wicker armchair and watched him. The sweep and dash of the brush on the canvas made the only sound that broke the stillness, except when, now and then, Hallward stepped back to look at his work from a distance. In the slanting beams that streamed through the open doorway, the dust danced and was golden. The heavy scent of the roses seemed to brood over everything. After about a quarter of an hour, Hallward stopped painting, looked for a time at Dorian Gray, then for a long time at the picture, biting the end of one of his huge brushes and frowning. "It is quite finished," he cried at last, stooping down as he wrote his name in the long vermilion letters on the left-hand corner of the canvas. Lord Henry came over and examined the picture. It certainly was a wonderful work of art, and a wonderful likeness as well.
"My dear fellow, I congratulate you most warmly," he said. "It is the finest portrait of modern times. Mr. Gray, come over and look for yourself."
The lad started, as if awakened from some dream. "Is it really finished?" he murmured, stepping down from the platform.
"Quite finished," said the painter, "and you have sat splendidly today. I am awfully obliged to you." "That is entirely due to me," broke in Lord Henry. "Isn't it, Mr. Gray?"
Dorian made no answer, but passed listlessly in front of his picture and turned towards it. When he saw it, he drew back. His cheeks flushed for a moment, with pleasure. A look of joy came into his eyes, as if he had recognized himself for the first time. He stood there motionless, and in wonder, dimly conscious that Hallward was speaking to him, but not catching any meaning of the words. The sense of his own beauty came on him like a revelation. He had never felt it before. Basil Hallward's compliments had seemed to him to be merely the charming exaggeration of friendship. He had listened to them, laughed at them, forgotten them. They had not influenced his nature. Then had come Lord Henry, with his strange panegyric on youth, his terrible warning of its brevity. That had stirred him at the time, and now as he stood gazing at the shadow of his own loveliness, the full reality of the description flashed across him. Yes, there would be a day when his face would be wrinkled and wizen, his eyes dim and colourless, the grace of his figure broken and deformed. The scarlet would pass away from his lips, the gold steal from his hair. The life that was to make his soul would mar his body. He would become dreadful, hideous, and uncouth. As he thought of it, a pang of pain struck through him like a knife, and it made each delicate fibre of his nature quiver. His eyes deepened into amethyst, and across them came a mist of tears. He felt as if a hand of ice had been laid upon his heart.
"Don't you like it?"
cried Hallway at last, stung a little by the lad's silence, not understanding what it meant.
"Of course he likes it," said Lord Henry. "Who wouldn't like it? It is one of the greatest things in modern art. I will give you anything you like for it. I must have it."
"It is not my property, Harry."
"Well, whose property is it?"
"Dorian's, of course," answered the painter.
"He is a very lucky fellow."
"How sad it is," murmured Dorian Gray, with his eyes still fixed upon his own portrait. "How sad it is that I shall grow old, and horrible, and dreadful. But this picture will remain always young. It will never be older than this particular day of June. If it were only another way, if it were I who was to always be young, and that picture was to grow old, for that I would give anything. Yes, there is nothing in the whole world I would not give. I would give my soul for that."
"You would hardly care for such an arrangement, Basil," cried Lord Henry, laughing. "It would be rather hard on the lines of your work." "I should object very strongly, Harry," said Hallward.
Dorian Gray turned and looked at him. "I believe you would, Basil. You like your art better than your friends. I am no more to you than a green bronze figure. Hardly as much, I dare say." The painter stared in amazement. It was so unlike Dorian to speak like that. What had happened? He seemed quite angry. His face was flushed and his cheeks were burning. "Yes," he continued, I am less to you than your ivory Hermes or your silver fawn. You will like them always. How long will you like me? Till I have my first wrinkle, I suppose. I know now that when one loses one's good looks, whatever they may be, one loses everything. Your picture has taught me that. Lord Henry Wotton is perfectly right. Youth is the only thing worth having. When I find that I am growing old, I shall kill myself.
Hallward turned pale and caught his hand. Dorian, Dorian, he cried. Don't talk like that. I have never had such a friend in you. And I shall never have another. You are not jealous of material things, are you? You who are finer than any of them.
I am jealous of everything whose beauty does not die. I am jealous of the portrait you have painted me. Why should I keep it? Why should I keep what I must lose? Every moment that passes takes something from me and gives something to it. Oh, if it were only the other way. If the picture could change, and I could be always what I am now. Why did you paint it? It will mock me some day. Mock me horribly.
The hot tears welled into his eyes. He tore his hand away, and flinging himself on the divan, he buried his face in the cushions, as though he were praying. "This is your doing, Harry," the painter said bitterly. Lord Henry shrugged his shoulders.
It is the real Dorian Gray, that is all.
It is not.
If it is not, what have I to do with it?
You should have gone away when I asked you, he muttered.
I stayed when you asked me.
Harry, I can't quarrel with my two best friends at once, but between you both, you have made me hate the finest piece of work I have ever done, and I will destroy it. What is it but canvas and colour? I will not let it come across our 3 lives and mar them. Dorian lifted his golden head from the pillow, and with pallid face and tear-stained eyes, looked at him as he walked over to the deal painting table that was set beneath the high-curtained window. What was he doing there? His fingers were straying about among the litter of tin tubes and dry brushes, seeking for something. Yes, it was for the long palette knife with its thin blade of lithe steel. He had found it at last. He was going to rip up the canvas. With a stifled sob, the lad leaped from the couch and rushed over to Hallward and tore the knife out of his hand and flung it to the other end of the studio.
"Don't, Basil, don't," he cried. "It would be murder."
"I'm glad that you appreciate my work at last, Dorian," the painter said coldly when he had recovered from his surprise. "I never thought you would."
Appreciate it? I am in love with it, Basil. It is a part of myself. I feel that.
Well, as soon as you are dry, you shall be varnished and framed and sent home. Then you can do with yourself what you like. He walked across the room and rang the bell for tea. You will have tea, of course, Dorian? And so will you, Harry. Or do you object to such simple pleasures?
"I adore simple pleasures," said Harry. "They are the last refuge of the complex, but I don't like scenes except on the stage. What absurd fellows you are, both of you. I wonder who it is that defined a man as a rational animal. It was the most premature definition ever given. Man is many things, but he is not rational. I am glad he is not, after all, though. I wish you chaps would not squabble over the picture. You had much better let me have it, Basil. This silly boy doesn't really want it, and I really do."
"If you let anyone have it but me, Basil, I shall never forgive you," cried Dorian Gray. "And I don't allow people to call me a silly boy."
You know this picture is yours, Dorian. I gave it to you before it existed.
"And you know you have been a little silly, Mr. Gray, and that you don't really object to being reminded that you are extremely young."
I should have objected to it very strongly this morning, Lord Henry.
"Ah, this morning. You have lived since then."
There came a knock at the door,
and the butler entered with a laden tea tray and set it down on a small Japanese table. There was a rattle of cups and saucers, and the hissing of a fluted Gregorian urn. 2 globe-shaped china dishes were brought in by a page. Dorian Gray went over and poured out the tea. The 2 men sauntered languidly to the table and examined what was under the covers.
"Let us go to the theatre tonight," said Lord Henry. "There is sure to be something on somewhere. I have promised to dine at White's, but it is only with an old friend, so I can send him a wire to say that I am ill, or that I am prevented from coming in the consequence of a subsequent engagement. I think it would be rather a nice excuse. It would have all the surprise of candour." "It is such a bore putting on one's dress clothes," murmured Hallward, "and when one has them on they are so horrid." "Yes," the Lord Henry answered dreamily, "the costume of the 19th century is detestable. It is so sombre, so depressing. Sin is the only real colour element left in modern life."
"You really must not be saying things like that before Dorian, Harry."
"Before which Dorian? The one who is pouring out the tea for us, or the one in the picture?"
"Before either." "I should like to come to the theatre with you, Lord Henry," said the lad.
"Then you shall come. And you shall come too, Basil, won't you?"
"I can't, really. I would sooner not. I have a lot of work to do."
"Then you and I will go alone, Mr. Gray."
"I should like that awfully." The painter bit his lip and walked over, cup in hand, to the picture. "I shall stay with the real Dorian," he said sadly. "Is that the real Dorian?" cried the original of the portrait, strolling across to him. "Am I really like that?"
"Yes, you are just like that."
"How wonderful, Basil."
"At least you are like it in appearance. But it will never alter," sighed Hallward. "That is something." "What a fuss people make about fealty!" exclaimed Lord Henry. "Why, even love is purely a question for physiology. It has nothing to do with our own will. Young men want to be faithful and are not. Old men want to be faithless and cannot. That is all one can say."
"Don't go to the theatre tonight, Dorian," said Hallward. "Stop and dine with me." "I can't, Basil." "Why?" "Because I have promised Lord Henry Wotton to go with him." "He won't like you the better for keeping your promises. He always breaks his own. I beg you not to go." Dorian Gray laughed and shook his head. "I entreat you." The lad hesitated and looked over at Lord Henry, who was watching them from the tea-table with an amused smile. "I must go, Basil," he answered. "Very well," said Hallward, and he went over and laid down his cup on the tray. "It is rather late, and as you have to dress, you better lose no time. Good-bye, Harry. Good-bye, Dorian. Come and see me soon. Come tomorrow." "Certainly. You won't forget?" "No, of course not," cried Dorian. "And Harry!"
"Yes, Basil?"
"Remember what I asked you, when we were in the garden this morning."
"I have not forgotten it."
"I trust you."
"I wish I could trust myself," said Lord Henry, laughing. "Come, Mr. Gray. My hansom is outside, and I can drop you at your own place. Good-bye, Basil. It has been a most interesting afternoon."
As the door closed behind them, the painter flung himself down on a sofa, and a look of pain came onto his face. That concludes our tale for this week, my friend. Please return next week, and we will continue our journey through The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. If you wish to rest here some more, please find a space that suits you, whether you curl up by the fire, partake in some food and beverages in our kitchen, take a nap in one of our many rooms, or take a stroll around the garden. Please know you are always welcome at Sniper's Rest, my friend. If you are continuing your journey, the multiverse has some interesting paths for you today. To the north, 3,000 years into the future, humanity has carved a bloody path throughout the known universe. You take command at the final frontier, the final push for domination. Good luck. To the west, your best friend is hell-bent on being an adventurer. You, however, are not so sure. But you adore them, so you join their party as a healer. Immerse yourself in a beautiful story about love, anxiety, and fighting the monsters to save your home. All in a day's work, right? To the east, you're the owner of a popular tavern in a fantasy land. Serve customers drinks, listen to their stories, and help give them advice on their adventures. Time to whack on a smile and get to work. And if you are making your own way out there, good luck, my friend, wherever you end up. Wherever you come from and wherever you're going, thank you for spending some time here with us at Sniper's Rest. Remember to take care of yourself, be kind to others, hydrate, take a moment to look out into the world and marvel at how incredible it all is. How incredible you are, friend. Until next time, please take care on your way.